Hi, in my last video I showed how I made a ring out of black walnut and maple, and I mentioned at the beginning that I was planning on using this in my first segmented bowl. Unfortunately, after I started kind of sizing things up for the first bowl I wanted to make, I found that this was just a little too narrow for a larger usable bowl. I'll eventually probably use this in something, but really, when you look at the size, it's probably just a little too small for anything useful. So what I ended up doing was making this bowl out of segmented rings. Again, still using black walnut and maple. The finish ended up being linseed oil. I kind of fretted over what I wanted to finish it with. But in the end, a friend of mine and fellow woodworker gave me some linseed oil before he moved, and decided I'd put that to good use for this first one. The outer diameter is about 7 1/4, and it started off at about 7 3/4 or so before I turned it down. And in this video, I'll only show most of the steps of how I built this. Unfortunately, I didn't get any video of when I was building up all the rings, so that's going to start off as still pictures. But then eventually I have some video of me actually turning this bowl and finishing it. So thanks for sticking around and watching.
So I started off with cutting up all the ring pieces, the segments, and getting the rings put together using Frank Hauer's method of putting shims in to make up for the differences in angles. And I like to use band clamps, hose clamps, to hold the rings together. They're cheap and they work pretty well. Seems to get the job done. Once they were all dried, basically just took them to the sander and made sure all the faces were flat. Started gluing them up into the stacks. Tried to alternate the seams, but in some cases I couldn't. In some of the rings, the faces were somewhat off, so I actually put them on the lathe and used the lathe to turn the faces flat. You can see here that I'm using my my flat carbide tip, well, I think what they call the rougher, but it's actually really good for getting a surface nice and flat, at least flat enough that you can then take a sanding block to it, and that really seems to get it nice and flat. I occasionally use a ruler, metal ruler, just to check it for flatness, and if I have any high spots, I'll go back to it with the rougher and try to lower those spots first. And then I'll use a sanding block, a good flat block with some about a 220 grit, 180 grit sandpaper, and that seems to help a lot to get the faces nice and flat, so that way the rings will get a nice tight glue joint between the two of them. And again, some of the rings I had to clean up, so I was facing off both sides of the ring of the certain rings and trying to get those nice and flat. And again, using the sanding block after I used the flat carbide rougher to get a majority of the inconsistencies off each face of the ring. And then again, I use a sanding block to finish up those surfaces. At some point I had this down to a pretty good science where I could go through them pretty quickly. When you've got a bunch of these things to make, it takes time. Alright, now I've got the bottom glued on to the stack, and now here's all the rings being glued together. I started kind of gluing them into sections and then gluing those sections together. That seemed to work pretty well. If I tried to glue too much together at once, it would just slide around on me and just turn into a big mess, and keeping everything aligned was really tough. So by doing it in the sections, that seemed to work pretty well. I try not to get too elaborate with the clamping, considering this is the first time I've ever done this, and the basic bar clamps seem to work pretty well. So here I had to use my giant jaws, so I could put the whole thing on the lathe and use the lathe and the tailstock to glue my waste block on. The giant jaws obviously hold the whole bowl assembly really nicely, and keeps it fairly square and round to the lathe. And you can see here I'm just first putting it on the lathe, and then finding a rough circle where the waste block should be glued on, and just use some tight bond too, and just use the tailstock to hold the waste block. And here you can see I added a board in between. Then I turn that waste block nice and round, so that way when I put my dovetail jaws on, it's going to be nice and round and won't be oblong of any sort. I cut that block off, or cut it out on the bandsaw, so it was a little bit rough. And just checking to see if the jaws would fit. And now gotta switch it around and put my dovetail jaws on the chuck and put the whole thing in there, or in the dovetail jaws. Now I put the whole thing back on the lathe, and now we're ready to start turning. This is the first time I'd turned anything like this, so it was a little bit nerve-wracking, knowing that I'd put probably about a week and a half of time into making all these rings and getting the whole thing glued together. I was a little apprehensive, but at some point I just had to put it on the lathe and do it. Here I'm just trying to get the basic shape of the outside of the bowl, and get it turned down to the point where everything's fairly smooth and there's no bumps or steps from the rings. Took a little bit of time to get that, and I used the roughing carbide gouge for that entire process. That seemed to leave a pretty nice surface. And now I've started on the inside, and for this I'm actually using what Easy Tool calls the detailer, or I'm sorry, the finishing tool. It's a carbide. It's got a round carbide cutter on it, and it's real good for doing like an inside of a bowl or anything that needs to have some curve to it. I found this tool I could use for the entire inside of the bowl. Now I started with some fairly high grit, probably about 120 grit sanding blocks. I like these sanding sponges. They let you get in there and get into the curve of the bowl. And then I think I finished up with like a 220 grit sanding sponge, and I did that to the inside and the outside. Now I'm switching back over to my giant jaws, or the big jaws, so I could put it back on the lathe, and now I can turn off the waste block. And you can tell it's got my garage door open. It was actually the next day. And finally, some linseed oil. I put a nice coat on and let it sit for an hour. Then I came back and took off the excess and rubbed it with a clean cloth, and I think the results are pretty good. It came out pretty nice for the first time. I was real happy with the way the wood came out. Thanks for watching. Please leave me some comments if you like what I was able to do for my first segmented bowl.